So I have one more announcement before we get rolling this morning. They have been working on the fire alarm here at Linwood, and maybe some of you heard it on your way in. And I'm told that we may hear it again, maybe several times. And there could even be a voice that comes along with it telling us to exit the building. I am told that if that voice comes on telling us to exit the building, we can disregard it, and we can somehow try to carry on with our normal church service. So we will do the best we can. So don't panic if you're hearing a lot of bells and whistles and commanding voices telling us to run from fire. All right, so today we are picking back up in this series. The Gospel of John contains 7 miracles, or what John often calls signs, and each one is specifically chosen by John because it reveals something unique about the identity of Jesus. And today we come to the 4th sign. And throughout this series, we've been observing together an ancient custom, one that is still very much practiced in churches around the world. Out of reverence for the sacredness of the Scriptures, we're standing together as the text is read. So please stand together as I read John chapter 6, verses 1 to 15. It says, "Sometime after this, Jesus crossed to the far shore of the Sea of Galilee, that is, the Sea of Tiberias. And a great crowd of people followed him because they saw the signs he had performed by healing the sick. Then Jesus went up on a mountainside and sat down with his disciples. The Jewish Passover festival was near. When Jesus looked up and saw a great crowd coming toward him, he said to Philip, 'Where shall we buy bread for these people to eat?' He said this only to test him, for he already had in mind what he was going to do. Philip answered him, 'It would take more than a half year's wages to buy enough bread for each one to have a bite.' Another of his disciples, Andrew, Simon Peter's brother, spoke up. 'Here is a boy with 5 small barley loaves and 2 small fish, but how far will they go among so many?' Jesus said, 'Have the people sit down.' There was plenty of grass in that place, and they sat down. About 5,000 men were there. Jesus then took the loaves, gave thanks, and distributed to those who were seated as much as they wanted. He did the same with the fish. When they had all had enough to eat, he said to his disciples, 'Gather the pieces that are left over, let nothing be wasted.' So they gathered them and filled 12 baskets with the pieces of the 5 barley loaves left over by those who had eaten. After the people saw the sign Jesus performed, they began to say, 'Surely this is the prophet who is to come into the world.' Jesus, knowing that they intended to come and make him king by himself." Okay, you can be seated. By this point in his ministry, Jesus has been up to a lot. He's been teaching, and he's been healing people en masse. And this is only the 4th sign that's described in detail by John, but all throughout his gospel, we're to understand that Jesus has been performing, and John refers to Jesus having performed many signs. Okay, for instance, at the beginning of this story, just verses 1 and 2, we're told, sometime after this, Jesus crossed to the far shore of the Sea of Galilee, and a great crowd of people followed him. Why? Because they saw the miraculous signs he had performed on the sick. And the idea is that Jesus has been performing all of these signs, all of these miracles everywhere. And so in John, the 7 signs that he decides to describe are kind of like Sports Center's top plays. You know, these are just the highlights. And so at this point, there's this huge buzz about Jesus. And the whole region is awakened. And we're told that he crosses over the Sea of Galilee, presumably by boat, which is a very big lake. It's 13 miles by 7 miles. And then on the other side, when he gets to the shore, he walks up the other side on a hill, and he sits down to teach. And so as he and the disciples look out over the horizon, they see this massive crowd coming toward them. We're told here that there were 5,000 men, which means that when you factor in women and children, we're talking about a crowd of around 20,000 people. Okay, now the entire region of Galilee was only about 40,000 in population. So that means that approximately half of the people in the entire region crossed over by boat or hiked around to follow Jesus on the other side of the lake. So it's absolutely no understatement by John when it says Jesus saw a great crowd coming toward him. And I'm thinking it must have felt like Max Yasker's dairy farm on the first day of Woodstock. I mean, just people coming in, and I'm sure they all looked like hippies, you know? Crowds just coming in by the droves. And so Jesus, he sees the crowds coming in, and they're all watching the crowds coming in. It's like, wow. And Jesus turns to Philip and asks, where shall we buy bread for all these people to eat? Now, Philip was a local. He was from a town called Bethsaida, which was only about 9 miles away. So, I mean, he's the most local guy they've got. If anyone knew where to get food, it would be Philip. But Philip's like, well, actually, Jesus, we don't have Panera bread in our region yet. Still more of an East Coast thing. And so, even if we did, Jesus, I'm just pointing out, there are like 20,000 people. In other words, Jesus, we don't have what it takes to do this. Like, not even close. This is what you're suggesting is way beyond our capacity. A few years ago, researchers at Carnegie Mellon University performed a study to discover what motivates people to respond to the needs of others. And in this study, participants were measured by their willingness to give to charity. So all participants were given a letter from Save the Children, but one group was given one version of the letter, and another group was given a different version of the letter. And so the first group got a letter that was based on statistics, okay, the statistical magnitude of all of the problems that are facing children in Africa. Okay, so the scope of the problem, like statistically, was the primary motivator. The second group got a very different kind of letter. Their letter featured a description of one 7-year-old girl named Rokia and the problems she was facing and the struggles of her daily life and what all of this meant through her eyes. Okay, now, which letter would you predict produced more charitable giving? The second one. Okay, absolutely. And I think most of us would assume that that's true. The letter that focused on, okay, one child, her life, her personality, her struggles, her suffering, resulted in twice as much giving as the letter that spelled out for people the magnitude and the scope of the problem. And this type of study has been replicated over and over and over in various contexts, in various ways by various researchers, and the results are consistent. Stats about the scope, okay, or the magnitude of the problem usually don't elicit much of a response. Okay, very simple personal stories do. Now, maybe you're looking at this and you're wondering, okay, but maybe if you combine the personal story with the statistics that help people see how big this is, maybe you'll get an even greater response. And the answer to that is nope. Like, not at all. Giving the stats actually decreases the response. Okay? A personal story by itself consistently elicits more charity than a personal story that's blended with statistics. So including the stats spelling out the magnitude will almost always hinder people taking action. As soon as you let people know how big the problem is, they stop responding. Now, psychologists explain this by what they call the drop in the bucket effect. Okay, focusing on the extent of the problem leads to paralysis. And the idea is if we feel overwhelmed by the scale of a problem, we often don't do anything about it because we don't think we can make a difference. In other words, it's easy to let what we can't do keep us from doing what we can. So here's Philip, the hometown guy, and Jesus looks at this crowd of 20,000 flooding in, and he says, hey, Phil, where should we buy bread for all these folks? And Philip's like, are you kidding? He's like, you are. You're kidding, aren't you? Are you kidding? And Jesus, I don't know if Jesus is just kind of, Philip can't read him, he's just like, and John tells us at this point, Andrew jumps into the conversation. He hears what's going on. Andrew jumps in and he says, well, here's a boy with 5 small barley loaves and 2 little fish, and he's looking out across the sea of people. And he says, but how far will they go among so many? Now, I have to assume that all of this is being said like with a smile, because I don't envision Andrew seriously suggesting that they take this kid's lunch and they somehow try to divide it up among the masses. I think there's a lot of bantering that's going on back and forth here. I think there are a lot of crooked smiles between the disciples and Jesus, and then all of this is being exchanged. And so Andrew overhears this convo between Jesus and Philip, and it's an absurd conversation. It's just ridiculous. Feeding all of these people, like, really? And so he jumps in like, well, okay, Jesus, yeah, here's a kid with like a brown bag lunch, but I'm not sure it's really going to feed the masses. I'm not sure this is really going to get her done, Jesus. And so there's all this back and forth banter going. Jesus is suggesting the impossible, and everybody knows it. This is way beyond the natural capacity of the disciples. What Jesus is suggesting is absurd. Now, it's interesting because this is the only miracle that's described in all 4 Gospels. It's kind of weird to think about because of all the different miracles, of all the different signs that Jesus performed during his ministry, this is the only one that you can find in all 4 Gospels. And in Matthew, we're given a little bit more info about the dialogue that went on here. After Andrew tells Jesus about the 5 loaves and the fish, Jesus says, bring them here to me, which I think is awesome. Because he's essentially saying, bring to me everything that you have. Bring to me your full capacity. Let me touch what you're convinced is not enough to get the job done. And they do. They simply bring him what they have, and Jesus touches it, and something supernatural happens. Now, here's a principle, and I cannot overstate this or exaggerate this. Here's a dynamic that we see right here that God has used throughout history to accomplish miraculous things through very flawed, very ordinary people. Here's what happened. The disciples took what they had, and they did with what they had the only thing they knew to do, and then Jesus intervened and did what only he could do. And something that was beyond their capacity happened. The short version is, they did what they knew to do, and Jesus did what only he could do. They did what they knew to do. They said, okay, we're going to bring these to Jesus, and we're going to start passing out this little tiny bit of bread and this little tiny bit of fish. I'm going to do what I know to do. And then somehow, Jesus intervenes in this whole thing in a way that we don't understand to accomplish what only he could accomplish. And guys, this is what God does. This is how God works. He asks us to bring to him what we have. Then he takes it, and he touches it, and he somehow makes it enough. And I want to say something to you today that's like incredibly important. If you're a follower of Christ, this isn't new stuff. Like, this is not new. But we forget. We doubt. We become paralyzed. And so I just want to say to you today, okay, you've got to remember, you are not alone. Whatever it is that you're facing, you're not alone. And yes, you have limited capacity, but God doesn't. He's up to something all around you, and he's up to something in you. He's working. He's always working. And here's the thing. God isn't asking you to do what's beyond your capacity. He's asking you to bring him everything that you have. He's asking you to let him touch it. Let him do what he does, and then watch what happens. He's asking you to do what you know to do, and then let him do what only he can do. Now, if you're a Christ follower, you've encountered this principle in play at some point in your life. Like if you've given yourself to Jesus and you say, yeah, I'm going to follow Jesus. I'm going to give him everything I have. This principle right here is a big part of how you got there. Now, I may not know the ins and outs of your story, but I know this. Somebody in your past saw that you needed God. They believed it. And they did what they knew to do. Maybe they invited you to church, or maybe they invited you to Young Life, or maybe they answered for, some questions for you, or they just helped you move toward Jesus in some way. It can be so unique to each situation and each individual. And maybe it was your brother, or maybe it was your sister, or your mom, or your dad. Maybe you were really, really little, or maybe you were an adult. Maybe it was somebody at church when you were a kid, or maybe it was a friend from work as an adult. I don't know who it was for you. But somebody in your life did what they knew to do, and they talked to you, or they invited you, or they reached out to you, and then Jesus did what only Jesus can do. Somehow he got a hold of your heart. If you're a follower of Christ, here's what happened. Somebody or a group of somebodies did what they knew to do, and then God stepped in and did what only he can do. God started to shape your heart. God gave you a hunger for things that you would not have had a hunger for otherwise. God began to grow in you a passion for something that you had never been passionate about before. And the thing that ignited it, that sparked it, that got it kicked off, is that somebody in some capacity did what they could do, and then God did what only God can do. And friends, this is such an important part of how God works. We simply go do what we know, and Jesus takes it, and he does what only he can do with it. Now, here's the odd thing about all of this. When we're in the middle of it, it may not feel all that supernatural. I mean, when the disciples brought the stuff to Jesus, I don't think it felt in that moment like something supernatural was happening. And at the time, they took the steps to start passing it out. Nothing miraculous was really happening yet. It wasn't until they brought to Jesus what they had. It wasn't until they took the steps to start passing it out. It wasn't until they did what they knew to do that Jesus stepped in and did what only he can do. Now, here's what I'm saying. The disciples, they did something very normal. They did something that didn't seem very spectacular. And it wasn't until they were already moving that they saw Jesus make it into something special. And so my question for you this morning is very simple. What are you facing in your life right now that is beyond your capacity? Like, what are you up against where you look at your capacity and then you look at the magnitude of the problem and you realize the math just doesn't add up? Like maybe things have gone sideways recently with your career. Like the climate has changed with the market and things are starting to move fast and you look at what's happening and it just feels overwhelming and you wonder how things could ever work out now for your career. Or maybe you have a relationship that's gone sideways. Maybe it's your marriage. Maybe you're not connecting. And in reality, you haven't been connecting in a long, long time. And maybe there's some hurt and there's some distrust, or maybe there's this just ocean of disappointment. But when you look at your capacity and you look at the scope of the problem, you cannot see a solution. Or maybe you're struggling with one of your kids. You see them heading in a direction that you don't want them to go, but they seem dead set on going there. And you want to talk sense into them. I mean, you want to help them see all of the dangers ahead. You want to rescue them. But when you look at your capacity, and it's limited, and what scares you to death is that you know none of this is really up to you. You can't make choices for them. There are other influences in the world. The scope of the problem, as you look at it, is enormous. And your capacity feels so small. Or maybe someone you love is just running from God. You want so desperately for them to see the love of Jesus, to see it and get it. You want for them to see how good God is. You want them to discover what it is that you've discovered, that he loves, that he really, really loves, and that he forgives, and that he heals, and that he restores. And you look at them and you think, man, if they would just stop running. If they would turn and they would walk with him, and if they'd quit trying to find things in their life and fill themselves with empty things if they would just let him reveal himself to them. But they're so stubborn. They're so committed to running from him. And you look at your capacity and you see their hard-heartedness or their anger or their arrogance or their fear or their pride, and you look at it and you just feel overwhelmed. It just feels like, how could things ever change? I can't envision a scenario where they could ever be different, where this could actually change. And maybe it's your, someone that you just love dearly. Maybe it's your mom or your dad, or, maybe it's a brother or a sister, one of your kids. Maybe it's somebody from work or an old friend. Maybe it's your spouse. You just want him to see Jesus and you just want him to respond, but you can't envision a scenario where that could actually happen. Or maybe there's dysfunction in your family. And maybe that patterns, like these unhealthy patterns, they've been there so long and they run so deep, and sometimes you just wish everybody could get along. But you look at how bad it is and how long it's been that way. And you think, how could I ever do something that would make a difference? It seems so huge and your capacity feels so small. I don't know what it is that you might be facing in your life. I don't know what sort of situation seems bigger than you, but I know this. There is hope beyond your capacity. You're not alone. There's one that's with you, and his capacity is not limited like yours. And he has this powerful desire to take what you have and to somehow touch it and turn it into so much more than it actually is. I look at the feeding of the thousands that day, of the multitudes, and I think, well, okay, but couldn't Jesus have just sort of feeded everybody, fed everybody? Could he have just fed everybody out of nothing, as they say, ex nihilo? Could he have just generated food out of nowhere? Could he have just been look guys, bam, bread, look guys, bam, fish, and just, would have been pretty awesome. I think he could have done that. But for whatever reason, that isn't the way that he usually likes to work. He seems to get a lot of pleasure from working together with us on stuff. He seems to really enjoy letting us participate in the miraculous. He seems to deeply long for us to bring to him what we have, for us to give it over to him, let him touch it, and then let him turn it into enough. And so my question for you this morning is simply this: what do you have that you can bring to Jesus? In whatever it is that you're facing, what is it that you can bring to him? And maybe you look at it and you say, but that's not enough. You know what Jesus says? Of course it's not. Of course it's not. But I'm enough. And that's the beauty of walking with Jesus. We're no longer limited, by our capacity. And guys, when you get this, when you see this, when this is real to you, it blows the doors and the lid off of what's possible. It changes everything. This is absolutely central to living a life of faith. This is the foundation to beginning to participate in miracles. This is the key that unlocks a supernatural life. And so I just want to ask again, what are you facing? What is it in your world that you are certain is beyond your capacity? And what is it that you have that you can bring? What is it that you can take to Jesus and let him touch? 2 fish and 5 loaves was not enough. But in the hands of Jesus, it feeds 20,000. Now, this is a really cool story to me because the truth is, I love food and I love miracles. And so I really love food miracles. And one of my other favorites is when the Israelites are wandering through the desert and fresh manna every morning falls from heaven and it's delivered to their front door every morning. They just go out and pick it up every day. But after a while, and I can relate to this a little bit, I guess. But after a while, like manna for breakfast and manna for lunch and manna for dinner. And the kids are like, well, what are we going to do tomorrow? And they're like, manna for lunch, they just do the whole thing over again. The Israelites, they get sick of it, right? And they start complaining. And it's pretty amazing because they're complaining about a miracle of God providing for them. But they're tired of the manna and they want some other stuff. And they specifically cry out for some meat, okay? And what's amazing is that, like, despite their incessant whining, God patiently responded with a promise. Now, feeding 2 million people, like, is no easy task, especially when they're just, like, wandering through the middle of Nowheresville, like wandering through what's essentially a desert. You think about just, like, one course of meat for everybody in that situation would have taken a major miracle. We're talking about 2 million people. And God promises them that they're going to have meat to eat for an entire month. Now, when he tells this to Moses, Moses naturally has a hard time envisioning that. So he says to God, here I am among 600,000 men on foot, and you say, I will give them meat to eat for a whole month. And Moses is like, how is that? That's not even possible. How is that even? That's crazy. And so he says, would they have enough if flocks and herds were slaughtered for them? Would they have enough if all the fish in the sea were caught for them? See, Moses is looking at the scenario and he's doing the math in his head, and it just doesn't add up. It's not even close. He's trying to imagine any conceivable way that God could fulfill his promise, like even for a single day, let alone an entire month. You ever been there? Facing something in your life? And you're just like, I just can't see a scenario where this could work out. Well, Moses couldn't comprehend how God was going to deliver on his promissory note. The interesting thing is, it didn't keep him from cashing it. And God paid him, we're told, in the currency of quail, like birds. It says, here's the description from Numbers chapter 11. It says, now a wind went out from the Lord and drove quail in from the sea. It scattered them up to 2 cubits deep, okay, so about 3 feet deep, all around the camp, as far as a day's walk in any direction. All that day and night and all the next day, the people went out and gathered quail. Now, based on the Hebrew system of measurement, a day's walk was approximately 15 miles in any direction. So if you square the radius and multiply by pi, we're talking about 700 square miles of quail. I read that somewhere. I didn't actually calculate that. And you think about that 700 square miles of quail that are piled up 3 feet deep. Can you imagine having been an Israelite in the camp when all of this started happening? Like, you're seeing these birds that are just flocking in from nowhere. And the cloud of birds is so thick, it's like a foul eclipse. Like, it's just dark. And when it started raining birds, like, it must have felt like Quail-mageddon. And you think about this, like, sometimes God shows up, and then sometimes God shows off. And again, I don't know what you're facing these days. There's a good chance that it really does feel impossible to you. There's a good chance that you cannot envision a scenario where things could ever be different, where things could actually work out. And if it was all dependent on your capacity, the reality is that might just be the end of it. But God wants you to see that your capacity is never the ultimate limit. He has ways of doing the unimaginable. And he just might have in mind something for you or around you that you could never dream. You think with God, it's always cloudy, like with a chance of quail. Oh, come on, that was awesome. So you have to take to him what you have, and you have to let him touch it, and then watch what he does. Let's pray together. God, I thank you so much that we're not on our own. And that the barriers and the walls and all of the issues that we face in our life, they're not foreign to you. You know about them, you care about them. And I thank you that Scripture is filled with story after story after story where somebody was up against a wall and you met them there and you did the impossible and you broke through and you provided and you made what they had enough, more than enough. God, I thank you that we're not dependent upon our own capacity, that as we look at our own skills and our own knowledge and all the resources we have, you're not limited by that. There's so much more available through you. And I pray this morning for anyone that is really, really struggling with something in their life, a relationship or a situation that is just, it's gone haywire and it feels like there's no hope. God, I pray that you would help us to identify what is it that we have in our hands that we could bring to you. And I pray that you would help us to not be overwhelmed by the drop in the bucket effect and just say, well, but this wouldn't do anything. And so we sit around paralyzed. I pray that you would help us to move and to take to you what it is that we have and ask you to make it enough and ask you to move. And I pray that we would be a community of people that continually see miracles, that we see it right and left as we entrust ourselves to you, as we step out in faith, go where you're asking us to go, and let you be the one that provides and breaks down barriers and walls. God, thank you that there's hope. In Jesus' name.